Jordan Peterson has some controversial views on climate change, including some which I believe to be out of date. That said, he does have several valuable insights. After watching hours of his talks and interviews, I've narrowed it down to 8 rules for sustainability. I know many of you already will have seen a particular notorious clip of Jordan Peterson answering a Oxford Uni student's question on climate change. So let's begin here because I think you might hold it against me if I ignore it.
So I was wondering whether you thought climate change could be an issue that could unite us all on left and right, moving us beyond debates about C16 to discussions at the UN at Katowice next month, where perhaps humanity might finally discover its global map of meaning.
No.
As we'll see in a second, JP does not like virtue signalling, and I think that is partly what he's responding to there. But later on in his response to that question, he shows an opinion based on out-of-date information.
What's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again.
So you can probably already see people in the audience kind of rolling their eyes at that. And in the early 2000s, it wasn't clear that storing energy from solar energy to use at night and the wind to use when it's not windy was ever going to be practical. But a lot has changed in the past few decades.
So this problem needs to be solved. We need to store the energy that is generated during the day so that you can use it at night. Now, what you may not have noticed in that earlier slide where I showed the blue square was that there was one red pixel. Okay, in the blue square was a red pixel. Now it's zoomed in so you can see that red pixel. That is the size of the batteries needed to transition all of the United States to being solar with batteries.
So hopefully those first 2 clips didn't completely put you off and you're still watching, because Peterson does have some very helpful principles or rules for understanding what we should be doing about climate change. Rule number 1 is fight back against apathy and doom and gloom.
This is also the problem I have with much of the environmentalist movement, is there's a powerful stream of anti-human sentiment that motivates it, and masquerading under the guise of virtue on a planetary scale.
Human beings, we've got waste management problems, and there's a lot of us and we eat a lot, but, we're also trying as hard as we can to put things together as fast as we can. All things considered, there's always unreasonable people, but, for a bunch of creatures that only separated from chimpanzees 7 million years ago, we're not doing that bad.
The second rule is that we should all be taking individual responsibility. All too often, I see people complaining about climate change and simply blaming large corporations such as fossil fuel producers without actually doing anything themselves. Whilst I think there is value in protesting, and people should definitely be doing that to an extent, there is a danger of taking on a victim mentality when there are actually actions one could be taking to create change.
Because the argument, I think, is that individual responsibility does not change the climate, does not fix the problem that needs global collective responsibility. So I think that's the core of the question. Do you have a theory about that?
Well, fundamentally, I'm a psychologist, and my experience has been that people can do a tremendous amount of good for themselves and for the people who are immediately around them by looking to their own inadequacies and their own flaws and the things that they're not doing in their lives, and starting to build themselves up as more powerful individuals. And if they're capable of doing that, and then they're capable of expanding their career. And if they're capable of expanding their career and their competence, then they're capable of taking their place in the community as effective leaders. And then they're capable of making wise decisions instead of unwise decisions when it comes to making collective political decisions.
Rule number 3 goes along with the first rule of fighting against doom and gloom. Too often we hear about there being too many humans on planet Earth, and to think carefully about even having children. Jordan Peterson is inviting us here to reframe what overpopulation might mean to us.
So it depends on whether you think that human brains are the kind of resource that figures out how to do more with less, and that is what I think. There's been a huge argument for years between the economists and the biologists. The biologists often are pessimistic, and they basically adopt a Malthusian perspective, and that is that we'll continue to breed until we exhaust the planet and do in all of our resources. And the economists always counter that by saying, hey, don't be forgetting that we can constantly figure out how to do more with less and that we're pretty damn smart. And I'm afraid I'm on the side of the economists. But even more to the point, the projections right now indicate that we'll probably peak somewhere around 9 or 10 billion, sometimes by the middle of the 21st century, and then our population will start to decline pretty precipitously. And I think there's every reason to assume, especially at our current rate of technological progression, and our increasing willingness to take broader responsibility for the large-scale health of the planet, that we'll be able to manage that without too much problem. We can certainly grow enough food to do it if we put a little bit of effort into that. The trick is to have kids that are more good than harm. You know what I mean? Because people aren't only consumers, they're also producers. It's kind of appalling that we regard ourselves as consumers. So, if you're going to have kids, have good kids. Make them smart, make them tough.
Rule number 4 is be pragmatic and pick something that you can influence. As well as taking individual responsibility, JP reminds us that it's also important to pick something to work on where you can reasonably make a difference. In his own work in the context of climate change, it looks like for him that means focusing on the oceans and particularly overfishing.
It seemed to me that it was more logical in some ways to focus on problems that had a shorter horizon and somewhat more immediate returns, because that way you can tell if all the effort that you're putting into solving the problem is actually having some sort of positive consequence. And the oceanic management problem seemed to fit into that too. It wasn't intractable. It wasn't a problem that was rapidly disappearing on its own like world poverty seems to be. I don't think you could speed that up, the disappearance of poverty, any more than it's been sped up. It's sort of hit maximum improvement. So it sort of falls into the category of solvable problem with potentially proper interventions. The other thing is, as far as I can tell, there's no losers to fixing this.
Rule number 5 is to pay attention to the spiritual or archetypical dimension. There is a lot at stake with climate change, and the scientific materialist perspective alone may not be sufficient to make the collective changes necessary.
I have a proper appreciation for the grandeur and value of nature, even though it was frigid in the north.
And like I said, I'm not anti-human in any way, but the way this struck me was that it was a catastrophic aesthetic and spiritual loss, a loss of the absolute bounty of the planet, and the sort of thing that it evokes in the viewer or the experiencer, the same sort of thing that maybe is evoked when you look up at the sky and see the vast array of stars sort of spread out before you. It's the magnificence of nature, and we're denying ourselves the privilege of experiencing that increasingly.
Rule number 6 is a kind of shadow awareness rule. It is to avoid virtue signaling. It goes along with taking individual responsibility and being pragmatic. It's important to check your intentions.
I think generally people have things that are more within their personal purview that are more difficult to deal with and that they're avoiding, and that generally the way they avoid them is by adopting pseudo-moralistic stances on large-scale social issues so that they look good to their friends and their neighbors. That's what it looks like.
Rule number 7 is that if you don't like part of the current system, instead of just complaining about it, then take action, build something better, and get people to use that instead.
Boyan Slat, who's definitely worth looking up. Boyan, I think it's Boyan, and Slaat, Dutch kid, has figured out, he thinks, how to get rid of half the plastic in the oceans in the next 5 years. So you could go support him. That'd be a hell of a thing to do. He's a real genius. And there's lots of ways that the burden that we're placing on our planetary resources is going to be lifted. And the trick is to get out there and do something about it. Like Elon Musk is a good example.
Rule number 8 is a meta rule. Try to take an integrative, holistic view. Climate change is a hugely complex issue, and many areas seem at first to be contradictory when they're actually parts of a larger whole. For example, working on helping people get out of poverty, which might cause more carbon emissions in the short term, is actually very likely to be helpful for the environment in the longer term.
Once you get GDP up to about $5,000 per year, people start to become concerned with environmental issues. So if we make people rich fast enough, I don't think so. It'll happen too late for some things. It looks like we're going to top out at about 9 billion. I think we can handle that.
Like any human being, Jordan Peterson is not 100% right about the approach to tackling climate change. He would benefit from getting more up to date with the energy storage progress, for example. Personally, I find the principles of taking responsibility and slowly expanding your area of competence and influence and aiming to work on areas where you can actually do something very helpful and motivating. Hopefully you do as well.
We have to make some hard decisions about what kind of planet we want to leave to our descendants. But we don't have to do that in a miasma of self-hatred and contempt.